Hey, this is Brandon from Sweater Cat Designs, and welcome to the Inkscape Master Series. This series is for those of you who would like more advanced Inkscape tutorials. In each lesson of the series, we'll cover a specific topic in a lot of detail, then we'll apply what we learned by creating a sample project. In this class, we're going to learn all about how to use the powerful Trace Bitmap Dialog to vectorize imported images and use them in our drawings. For the project portions of the video, we'll learn how to use Trace Bitmap to turn an image into a logo, and we'll learn a couple ways to use it for adding texture to our drawings. For those of you who are already familiar with how Trace Bitmap works, you can find timestamps for all the sections in the description below, which you can use to skip over the technical stuff and get straight to creating the project. Okay, let's begin. Before we start using Trace Bitmap, we need to import an image that we want to trace. So first, let's go up to the File menu and choose Import. The image I'll use for this video is this butterfly image here. I provided a link to the image in the description below so that you can use it to follow along. You can also use a different image, but be aware that the higher the contrast there is between the parts of the image, the better the results will be. Okay, let's import the image by double-clicking it, and we can just click OK here. Next, we need to open the Trace Bitmap dialog. To do this, we can either go up to the Path menu and choose Trace Bitmap, or we can right-click the image and choose Trace Bitmap. In the Trace Bitmap dialog, we have three tabs. Single Scan, which creates a single path using a tracing of the image. Multicolor, which creates a group of paths, allowing us to get a more detailed result, and Pixel Art, which of course lets us vectorize pixel art. Let's first head back over to the Single Scan tab. At the top of the Single Scan tab, we have a list of detection modes that we can choose from. If we choose one, for example the default brightness cutoff mode, as long as we have an image selected, we can see a preview of what the tracing will look like at the bottom of the dialog. If we click the Apply button down here, it creates a tracing of the image. And this is all one big path, so we can do things like change the color of it, and we can simplify it. We can also cut things out of it. Okay, we can delete this path, then select the image again. Back at the top of the Trace Bitmap dialog, we have a threshold setting. With the brightness cutoff, Trace Bitmap detects areas of the image that are darker than the threshold, and only creates a tracing using those areas. As we increase the threshold, we start to get more of the brighter parts of the image in the tracing. Decreasing the threshold does the opposite. Another thing we can do is invert the image, giving us a tracing of just the brightest parts. We also have these three details settings. Speckles will ignore small spots in the image. Smooth corners will smooth out the sharp corners of the tracing. And Optimize will join together adjacent Bezier curve segments in the tracing. I find that changing these settings has almost no noticeable effect, so I usually don't bother with them. The last setting we have in here is this User Assisted Trace option. With this, we can draw a path around the part of the image we want. Give it a fill color. Select both the path and the image. And if we check User Assisted Trace, we can see that it only traces the part of the image under the path we created. We can click Apply, then move the path out of the way, and now I have a tracing of just the butterfly. Okay, I'll delete these paths, and select the image again. Let's turn User Assisted Trace back off. With the next detection mode, Edge Detection, it will attempt to create line art from the image. With this, we have an edge threshold setting we can change. Color quantization will first separate the image by colors, then create a tracing. The number of colors it uses is given by this color setting here. The next mode, Auto Trace, doesn't give us a preview, so we have to click Apply to see the result. This is similar to brightness cutoff, but it makes the path the dominant color of the image. For this mode, we have two settings we can change, but I find that changing them doesn't result in a very noticeable difference. The final mode, Centerline Tracing, also requires that we click the Apply button to see the result. This mode actually works better for vectorizing a line art image. Okay, that's it for the Single Scan tab, so now let's switch over to the Multicolor tab. This tab will create a tracing that consists of a group of paths. The number of paths it creates is given by this scan setting here. The default value is 8, so right now it will create 8 paths. Also, like with single scan, we have some detection modes we can choose from. This is what brightness steps gives us. Let's go ahead and click apply. Because multicolor performs multiple scans of the image, it takes a bit longer than single scan. Okay, here's the result. As we can see in the status bar, this is a group of 8 paths. We can double click the group to enter into it and access the individual paths. Increasing the scan setting will create more paths and give us a more detailed result. And decreasing it will do the opposite. We also have these 3 checkboxes here. The first one, smooth, will apply a Gaussian blur to the image before tracing it, giving us a smoother result. However, it's a very subtle difference. The next option, stack, will stack the scans on top of each other, attempting to fill in any gaps. If we do a tracing without stack checked, we can see that the tracing has a few transparent parts in it. On the other hand, if we do a tracing with stack checked, most of the transparent parts will be filled in. The final option, remove background, actually removes the brightest path from the tracing. This is useful with images that have a white or very bright background, as it will remove the background for us. Let's finish up by checking out the other detection modes. First, colors allows us to get most of the colors of the image in the tracing. Grays is basically a grayscale version of colors. And whenever I try the auto trace mode, it causes Inkscape to crash, so I'll just skip this one. We can also use the user assisted trace option with multicolor. And as you can see, this adds a white background to the tracing. So we can undo all of that, select these again, then check remove background before we click apply. Okay, now that we have a pretty good idea of how to vectorize images with Trace Bitmap, let's take a look at some ways that we can actually use it in our drawings. The image I'll use for the logo is this image of a mother and baby elephant and a couple of trees in silhouette. You can find a link to the image in the description below, in case you would like to use it to follow along. If you would like to use a different image instead, the main things we're looking for in the image is that the part we want to use is mostly a solid color and is quite darker than the rest of the image. This will look best for the type of logo we're going to create. Okay, so with the image imported into our document, let's go ahead and open the Trace Bitmap Dialog by right-clicking the image and choosing Trace Bitmap. Alright, so in the Trace Bitmap Dialog, we want to be on the Single Scan tab with Brightness Cutoff chosen as a detection mode. And for this image, I'm going to need to lower the threshold quite a bit in order to get rid of all of the background. .090 looks pretty good, so I'll click apply. Now we can move the tracing out of the way and delete the image. And if we want to, we can add the sun back to it. I'll just simply go to the circles and ellipses tool, hold Control and create a circle in here. And I'll make it black. Now we want to go to the select tool and select the tracing and the circle, and go to Path, Union to combine them into a single path. Okay, we can set the tracing aside for now. Let's work on some other parts of the logo. First, I'll switch back to the circles and ellipses tool, hold Control and create a large circle here. Now let's switch to the select tool and duplicate the circle by right-clicking it and choosing duplicate. Let's make the duplicate a different color just so we can see it. Now let's shrink it down some while holding Shift and Control. Okay, we're going to cut this circle out of the bigger one, but before we do that, let's duplicate again. For this one, let's turn off the fill color. Let's give it a stroke by holding Shift and clicking a color swatch. The color doesn't really matter, as we'll just be deleting the circle after we wrap some text around it. Let's hold Shift and Control and scale this one up some. Now we can select the center circle, hold Shift and select the black circle, and go to Path, Difference. Okay, let's next switch to the text tool and create a text object. Feel free to type whatever you want for your logo. I'll just go with Inkscape Master Series in all caps. We'll be cutting the text out of the black circle later, but for now let's make it a color that isn't black so we'll be able to see it. Let's also go up to the controls bar and change the alignment of the text to centered. This will make it easier to center the text on the circle. Now let's go to the select tool, hold Control and scale the text up some. Next, we can wrap the text around the circle with a stroke by selecting both the text object and the circle and going to Text, put on Path. Then we can select just the circle, click it again to get the rotation handles, and rotate it while holding Control until the text is centered at the top. Let's click the circle again to get back to the scale handles, hold Shift and Control, and scale it so that the text is pretty close to centered in the black area. Next, we can double click the text object to get to the text tool and change some of its features in the controls bar. We can use pretty much whatever font family we want, but I'll leave mine on Calibri. I'm going to click the spacing box here and add some spacing between the letters and the words. Okay, when we have the text the way we want it, we can turn it into a path by going to Path, Object to Path. Now let's switch to the Select tool, select the circle with a stroke, hold Shift and Control, and scale it up until it runs through the center of the text. We're now going to use the Pattern Along Path effect to put some kind of pattern along the circle at both ends of the text. The pattern you use is entirely up to you. I'll go with 3 stars. So first I'll switch to the Stars and Polygons tool and create a small star over here. I'm holding Control to restrict the angle of rotation. I don't want a stroke for this, so I'll turn it off by holding Shift and clicking the red X down here. Now I'll switch to the Select tool and duplicate the star, then hold Control and move it up here. I'll shrink this one down a bit while holding Shift and Control. I'm going to duplicate this one, hold Control and bring it down here. Now I want to put equal vertical spacing between the centers of these stars. I'll do this by selecting them all, opening the Align and Distribute dialog, and clicking this button. Okay, to use our objects as a pattern, we first need to turn them into a single path by going to Path, Union. Then let's copy the path into the clipboard by pressing Ctrl-C. Now let's select the circle with a stroke. Let's turn it into a path by going to Path, Object to Path. Then let's switch to the Node tool, select all of the circle's nodes, and click this button up here to turn them into symmetric nodes. This will prevent Pattern Along Path from warping the circle. Okay, now we can open the Path Effects dialog by going to Path, Path Effects, then click the plus button at the bottom of the dialog. And in here, let's click the icon for Pattern Along Path. Okay, in the Path Effects dialog, let's click this button on the end to link it to the path we copied into the clipboard. Let's change the pattern copy's type to single. Now we want to give this a fill color and turn off the stroke. And because we used the link button, we can scale the pattern by switching to the Select tool and selecting the pattern source path over here, then scaling it up or down while holding Shift and Control. Okay, let's select the pattern path here again, and in the Path Effects dialog, let's increase the tangential offset parameter until the pattern is where we want it near the text. That should be good. Now we can finalize the path effect by going to Path, Object to Path. Okay, to put a copy of this on the other side of the logo, we can turn on snapping up here, then go to Advanced Mode, and enable snapping to object rotation centers. Now we can click the pattern path to get the rotation handles, then snap its rotation center to the center of the logo. Then we can duplicate the path and press the H key to flip horizontally. There we go. Alright, now let's cut the pattern paths and the text out of this black part. First we need to select the text, which is a group of paths at the moment. Let's ungroup them by right-clicking it and choosing Ungroup. Now we can hold Shift and select both of the pattern paths, then union them all into a single path. Next, let's hold Shift and select the black path and go to Path, Difference. And we can go ahead and delete the pattern source path here as well. Okay, now let's work on adding our tracing here to the logo. First, with snapping to rotation center still enabled, let's switch to the Circles and Ellipses tool, snap to the logo's rotation center, hold Shift and Control, and create a circle in here. Now we can turn off snapping, then switch to the Select tool, hold Shift and Control again, and scale the circle up until it covers most but not all of the empty area. Let's lower the circle's opacity to about 50% or so, just so we'll be able to see the tracing beneath it. Now we can move the tracing over here and scale it down to the size we want. Then we can hold Shift and select the circle and go to Path, Intersection. We might for some reason get some extra parts left over outside of the logo. To get rid of this, we can switch to the Pen tool and create a path around the extra parts. Then switch to the Select tool, hold Shift and select the tracing, and go to Path, Difference. Okay, looking good. Let's now select both paths. Let's union them together. Next, we can add our ribbon with some text to the bottom of the logo. For the ribbon, let's switch to the Squares and Rectangles tool and create a rectangle over here for now. We can make it black and raise the opacity all the way up. Okay, let's go to the Select tool and duplicate the rectangle. Move it over here. Then grab the center left scale handle and drag it in some. Let's turn it into a path by going to Path, Object to Path, then switch to the Node tool, select the two left nodes, and click this button up here to insert a new node between them. Now we can grab the new node, hold Ctrl and drag it in some. Okay, now let's go back to the Select tool and duplicate this path. Flip it horizontally with the H key, hold Ctrl and bring it over to the right side. Now we can select all three of these objects and use the Align and Distribute dialog to put equal horizontal spacing between their centers. Okay, for the text, let's go to the Text tool and create a text object. I'll type Trace Bitmap for this one. And again, we can use whatever font family we want. I'll go with a nice script font like Pacifico. There's definitely not enough spacing between the words though, so I'll add some more. Now we can go to the Select tool and scale it up while holding Ctrl. Let's change the color of the text. Then let's hold Shift and select the rectangle here, and in the Align and Distribute dialog, with the last selected chosen as the anchor, let's align them vertically and horizontally. If necessary, we can select just the text object and scale it up or down while holding Shift and Ctrl. Next, we'll use the Bend Path effect to bend all of this. First, we need to turn the text object to a path by going to Path, Object to Path. Then we need to select all of these objects and group them together by right-clicking and choosing Group. Now let's go to the Path Effects dialog, click the plus button at the bottom, and click the icon for Bend here. Let's go ahead and click the Edit on Canvas button here to show the green line that we can use for bending. Now in order to be able to bend everything evenly, we need to select both nodes of the green line, then click this button up here to insert a new node at the center. Now we can select the new center node, click this button up here to turn it into a symmetric node, then hold Ctrl and drag out one of the handles. We don't want to bring them out too far, as I find this will cause the ends to become warped when we bend it. Okay, now we can grab the center node, hold Ctrl and drag up to bend the group. Okay, when we have it looking the way we want it, we can finalize the path effect by going to Path, Object to Path. Now let's switch to the Select tool and move the ribbon to about where we want it on the logo. I'll resize it a bit. Now we can hold Shift and select the other part of the logo and use the Align and Distribute dialog to center them vertically. Due to slight warping from the bending, it might not align them perfectly, so we can select just the ribbon group and use the left and right arrow keys to adjust it a bit. There we go. Okay, next we're going to cut some parts out of the ribbon, as well as leave a gap between the ribbon and the rest of the logo. First, let's ungroup all of the ribbon parts. Then let's select just a large path in the center. Let's duplicate it, then give it a stroke. We're going to cut this whole path out of the main logo path, as well as the two ends of the ribbon. First, let's lower the opacity of the path so that we can see exactly how much of the other paths that it's going to cut out. I'm going to open the Fill and Stroke dialog, then go to the Stroke Style tab and make the stroke a bit thicker. That should do it. Let's turn the stroke into a path by going to Path, Stroke to Path. This gives us a group consisting of the stroke path and the fill path, so we can ungroup them, then union them together. Okay, now we're going to need to use 3 of these paths for each of the 3 parts we'll be cutting. So first, let's duplicate this path. Then let's hold Shift and select one of the paths to cut, and go to Path, Difference. Let's duplicate this path again. Hold Shift and select one of the other paths, and do a difference again. For the third part, we can just use the original path here. Okay, cool. Now let's select the text group and ungroup it. Then union the paths together. Then we can cut the text out of the ribbon by holding Shift and clicking the large ribbon path, and going to Path, Difference. Okay, and it's entirely up to you whether or not to keep the circular part here under the ribbon, but if we wanted to get rid of it, we could switch to the pen tool and draw a path around it. Then switch to the Select tool, hold Shift and select the circular path, and go to Path, Difference. Alright, now we can select all of these paths and union them together. And we're pretty much done with the main part of the logo. Next we'll look at how we can add texture using Trace Bitmap. The first effect we can add with Trace Bitmap is to give our logo a scratchy, retro look. To do this, we first need to import an image that has a scratchy or bumpy texture. For demonstration, I'm going to use this image of leather. If you want to use the same image, you can find a link to it in the description, but any image with a similar texture should work fine. Okay, let's go ahead and import it. Let's switch to the Trace Bitmap dialog. I lowered the threshold here quite a bit for the elephant image, so I'm going to start raising it back up until I get something I like in the preview. That should be good, so I'll click Apply and move the tracing on top of the logo. And we can go ahead and delete the image now. I'll resize the tracing just a bit. Now because the logo we created is just one big path, we can simply cut the tracing out of the logo by selecting them both and going to Path, Difference. And now our logo has a scratchy texture. However, let's pretend that our logo consists of multiple objects and possibly multiple colors. In this case, we would need to use inverse clipping to cut the tracing out of the logo. To demonstrate, I'll undo to get the tracing back, select them both, and go to Object, Clip, Set Inverse Clip. This will take a bit longer. Okay, now we have basically the same result. I'll release the clip by right-clicking and choosing Release Clip. Then I'll do a difference on these 2 paths again. Okay, next we can add a background to our logo and give the background a grungy, old paper look. First, let's switch to the Squares and Rectangles tool and create a large rectangle for the background. Let's raise the opacity all the way up. Turn off the stroke. Now use the Fill and Stroke dialog to give this a tannish fill color. Okay, to apply an old paper look to this rectangle, we'll need to import an image with a grungy type of texture. I'll use this image of a dirty wall, which I've also included a link to in the description. Now we can go to the Trace Bitmap dialog and adjust the threshold until we have the result we're looking for. If the result seems a bit too dark, that's okay, because we can easily lower the opacity later to make it less intense. Alright, I like how this looks, so I'll click Apply, move the tracing onto the background, and delete the image. Let's adjust the tracing so that it fits the rectangle a bit better and completely covers it. Now we can switch to the Fill and Stroke dialog and bring down the opacity some. If we keep the tracing black, it will make the background look dirty, and if we change it to white, it will look more like the edges are old and fading. I'll leave it up to you to decide which one you prefer, but I'll leave mine white. We can also duplicate the tracing, flip it vertically with the V key and horizontally with the H key, then adjust it some so that it doesn't look too much like an exact copy of the other one. Now we can select both tracing paths and union them together. Then we can select the background rectangle by holding Alt and clicking inside the tracing path. Duplicate it by clicking this button up here. Hold Shift and select the tracing path, and go to Path, Intersection. Then select both of these objects and group them together. Let's now select the logo and bring it to the top with this button up here. Then let's hold Shift and select the background, and use the Align and Distribute dialog to align them vertically and horizontally. I'm also going to change the color of the logo to more of a dark goldish color. Finally, we can select the logo and the background and group them together. And that should do it for our Trace Bitmap Masterclass. As you can see, Trace Bitmap is an extremely useful and versatile feature, and I encourage you to continue testing it out on various types of projects. Okay, thank you very much for joining me in this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one. As we mentioned briefly at the beginning of this video, the third tab in the Trace Bitmap dialog is for vectorizing imported pixel art. To demonstrate this, I'll vectorize this pixel art image of some grapes. If you would like to follow along by using your own pixel art, it's important to note that when tracing pixel art, Trace Bitmap will create up to one path per pixel in the image. Because of this, if you try to vectorize an image that is too large, it can take quite a while. To give an idea of what size to use, this image is only 64 pixels by 64 pixels. Depending on your system, you might be able to do this with a slightly larger image, but I would definitely avoid going too much larger. Okay, so in the Pixel Art tab, the preview down here is pretty much useless, as it doesn't actually show us what the result would look like. To see the result, we need to click the Apply button. Here we go. We can see in the status bar that it's a group of 4,096 objects. This is the same as 64 times 64, so it created one object for every pixel in the image. If we double click the group to enter into it, we can modify the individual objects. Okay, back in Trace Bitmap, at the top here we have some heuristic settings. I'm actually not sure exactly what these settings do, and I've tried different settings on various images, but I haven't been able to see any changes. If anyone watching this happens to know how these work and would like to shine some light on them for us in the comments, that would be awesome. Anyway, at the bottom we have two output options to choose from. Unlike with the heuristic settings, changing this actually has a noticeable effect. As we saw earlier, the default option Voronoi creates a group of paths consisting of one path per pixel. B-splines, on the other hand, will go a step further and combine all adjacent paths that have the exact same color into a single path. So if we click Apply, we can see that this group only has 829 objects. If we zoom in some, we can see some thin gaps between the paths. We can see this in the other tracing as well. This is actually due to anti-aliasing, and if we wanted to get rid of the gaps, an easy way to do so is to duplicate the group. We can still see the gaps if we zoom in a lot, but they're much less noticeable now. Okay, that's how we can vectorize pixel art with Trace Bitmap. Thanks for watching.